Among the sinister ranks of American serial killers, few stand out as much as William Lester Suff, a man whose cruelty and cunning allowed him to perpetrate a horrifying series of murders in California during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Known as the Riverside Killer, Suff's horrifying acts sent shockwaves through the community, creating a chilling legacy of fear and loss. This story delves deeply into the life and crimes of a man who deceived those around him while carrying out unspeakable acts of violence. William Lester Suff was born on August 20, 1950, in Texas. From an early age, his life was marked by instability and a troubling lack of guidance. Growing up in a lower-middle-class family, Suff's childhood was reportedly devoid of any overtly violent or abusive experiences. However, many criminologists have observed that his later crimes reflected a lack of emotional development and a deep-seated anger that may have brewed quietly during these formative years. By his teenage years, Suff displayed signs of a volatile personality. He struggled to maintain friendships and often came across as socially awkward. Teachers and acquaintances noted his introverted nature and occasional bursts of temper. But these red flags were not enough to suggest the horrors he would later unleash. After graduating high school, Suff seemed to follow a conventional path. He got married and began working odd jobs to support his new family. But behind closed doors, cracks in his seemingly normal life were beginning to show. Suff's marriage was far from stable, marked by arguments and instances of domestic abuse. The turning point in his early life came with an act so monstrous it would overshadow everything else, though it was far from his last crime. In 1974, Suff and his then-wife were convicted of murdering their 2-month-old daughter, Dinah. The infant had been subjected to brutal physical abuse, with internal injuries so severe that even seasoned investigators were shocked. Suff and his wife both stood trial, and while his wife received a lighter sentence, Suff was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Despite the severity of his crime, Suff served only 10 years behind bars. His early release was part of a parole system riddled with flaws, a decision that would have devastating consequences. This release not only allowed him to roam free but also gave him the opportunity to hone his manipulative skills, which he would later use to deadly effect. After his release in 1984, Suff moved to California, settling in the Inland Empire region. Determined to rebuild his life, he found work as a county warehouse clerk, a seemingly unremarkable job that allowed him to blend seamlessly into society. On the surface, Suff appeared to have turned a new leaf. He was described by co-workers as friendly, if unassuming, and he maintained a low profile in his community. What no one realized was that Suff's outward demeanor was a carefully constructed facade. Beneath the surface, he was harboring dark fantasies that would soon spiral into a reign of terror. His job, which involved delivering supplies to government offices, gave him access to knowledge of law enforcement procedures, a resource he would use to evade capture for years. Suff's killing spree began in 1986 and would continue unabated until his arrest in 1992. During this time, he targeted sex workers, many of whom were living on the margins of society. These women, often ignored or dismissed by the broader community, became easy prey for a man as cunning and ruthless as Suff. His modus operandi was both calculated and grotesque. Suff would lure his victims into his vehicle under the pretense of soliciting their services. Once they were isolated, he would unleash unimaginable violence. Strangulation was his preferred method of murder, but many of his victims also suffered brutal beatings, stabbings, and post-mortem mutilation. In some cases, body parts were removed, leading investigators to suspect that Suff kept trophies of his crimes. The locations where the bodies were found painted a grim picture. Deserted roadsides, isolated fields, and abandoned lots became dumping grounds for his victims. The state of the bodies suggested not just a desire to kill, but a deep-seated need to humiliate and degrade his victims, reinforcing his dominance over them even in death. As the bodies began to mount, the Riverside community was gripped by fear. The discovery of multiple victims with eerily similar injuries confirmed the presence of a serial killer. News of the killings spread rapidly, with local media dubbing the unknown assailant the Riverside Killer. Law enforcement faced significant challenges in their investigation. Many of the victims were transient or had little connection to the community, making it difficult to trace their last movements. Additionally, the stigma surrounding sex work meant that some of the victims were not immediately reported missing. These factors, combined with Suff's careful planning, allowed him to evade capture for years. Despite the fear that permeated the community, Suff managed to maintain his double life. To those around him, he was an ordinary man with a penchant for cooking and socializing. He even participated in charity events and office gatherings, where he presented himself as a model citizen. This ability to compartmentalize his life added another layer of complexity to the investigation. One of the most macabre aspects of Suff's story is the rumor that he incorporated elements of his crimes into his everyday life. Known for his love of cooking, Suff often brought homemade dishes to office potlucks and community events. It was later speculated that some of these dishes may have contained human remains, a theory that, while unproven, underscores the chilling depths of his depravity. Whether or not this claim holds truth, it speaks to Suff's sadistic nature and his need to assert control not just over his victims, but over those around him. It also highlights the lengths he went to maintain his facade, using his culinary skills as a tool to further ingratiate himself with unsuspecting acquaintances. By the early 1990s, law enforcement had formed a task force dedicated to apprehending the Riverside Killer. Advances in forensic science, coupled with psychological profiling, began to narrow the field of suspects. However, Suff's careful planning and his understanding of police procedures allowed him to stay one step ahead. The breakthrough came in 1992, when Suff was stopped for a routine traffic violation. Inside his vehicle, officers found incriminating evidence, including a knife and bloodstains that matched one of his victims. Further investigation revealed a trove of evidence linking him to multiple murders, including items taken from the victims as trophies. William Suff's trial began in 1995, capturing national attention. The courtroom was packed with journalists, grieving families, and members of the community eager to see justice served. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including DNA analysis, forensic findings, and eyewitness testimony, all of which pointed conclusively to Suff's guilt. Throughout the trial, Suff remained calm and emotionless, showing no remorse for his actions. His defense team attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but the sheer weight of the prosecution's case left little room for doubt. After a relatively brief deliberation, the jury found Suff guilty of 12 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, a punishment that many felt was fitting for a man whose crimes had caused so much pain and suffering. To this day, he remains on death row in California. The case of William Lester Suff serves as a grim reminder of the capacity for human evil. His ability to lead a double life, his meticulous planning, and his lack of remorse have made him a subject of fascination for criminologists and psychologists. For the victims' families, however, his crimes are a source of endless pain and loss. Suff's story also highlights the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities. Many of his victims were targeted precisely because they were overlooked by society, a fact that underscores the importance of supporting and protecting those at risk. While much of the focus has been on Suff and his crimes, it is vital to remember the victims whose lives were cut short. These women were daughters, sisters, and friends, each with their own hopes and dreams. Their stories deserve to be told, and their memories honored. The story of William Lester Suff is a chilling cautionary tale. It serves as a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, lurking behind the masks of normalcy and respectability. As we reflect on his crimes, we are called to remain vigilant, to support the vulnerable, and to remember that justice, though sometimes delayed, must always be pursued. Even decades after his conviction, the specter of William Lester Suff lingers in the collective memory of those who lived through his reign of terror. The Riverside Killer's case remains a focal point of discussion in true crime circles, criminology courses, and forensic psychology studies. His ability to evade capture for years, coupled with his chillingly ordinary appearance, has made him a case study in how serial predators can hide in plain sight. Suff's case also brought renewed scrutiny to the parole system that allowed him to walk free after murdering his infant daughter. The revelation that such a brutal act had not been met with a lifetime of accountability provoked outrage and calls for reform. Many wondered how different the outcome might have been had Suff remained behind bars after his initial conviction. For the law enforcement officers who worked on the case, Suff's capture was both a triumph and a sobering reminder of the challenges they face in their line of work. The task force dedicated to tracking him spent years piecing together the evidence, chasing leads, and coordinating across jurisdictions. For many officers, it was a career-defining case, one that highlighted both the capabilities and the limitations of investigative techniques in the late 20th century. The case also emphasized the importance of community involvement in solving crimes. Many of the breakthroughs came from tips, observations, and information provided by concerned citizens. This cooperation between law enforcement and the public serves as a testament to the power of collective action in bringing justice to light. The media coverage of Suff's trial and conviction was intense, feeding the public's fascination with serial killers. Newspapers and television outlets delved into every detail of his crimes, his background, and his trial proceedings. Documentaries and books about Suff soon followed, each seeking to unravel the enigma of the Riverside Killer. However, this media frenzy was not without controversy. Some critics argued that the sensationalization of Suff's crimes detracted from the suffering of his victims and their families. Others questioned whether such attention might inadvertently glorify the killer, turning him into a figure of infamy rather than infamy. William Suff's death sentence reignited debates around the use of capital punishment in the United States. Supporters of the death penalty saw his case as a clear example of its necessity, arguing that someone capable of such horrific acts deserved the ultimate punishment. Opponents, however, pointed to the years of appeals and the financial and emotional toll on the victims' families, questioning whether life imprisonment without parole might have been a more effective solution. As of today, Suff remains on death row, his execution date indefinitely delayed by the complexities of California's legal system. For some, this limbo is a source of frustration. For others, it is a grim reminder of the moral and practical challenges inherent in pursuing ultimate justice. Suff's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about society's role in enabling predators like him to operate undetected. His victims were women living on the fringes, often overlooked or dismissed by society. This marginalization made them easy targets and allowed Suff to continue his killing spree for years without significant interference. The case serves as a stark reminder of the need to value every life equally, to listen to those whose voices are often drowned out, and to ensure that justice is pursued regardless of a victim's social standing. It also highlights the importance of early intervention in cases of domestic abuse and other red flags that can signal deeper issues. For the families of Suff's victims, the pain of loss endures. Each anniversary of a loved one's death brings fresh waves of grief, compounded by the knowledge that the man responsible remains alive, albeit imprisoned. Memorials and vigils held in their honor serve as a way to keep their memories alive and to remind the world of the humanity behind the headlines. In Riverside, the scars left by Suff's crimes run deep. While the city has moved forward, the shadow of the Riverside Killer is an inescapable part of its history. The case continues to shape conversations around safety, law enforcement, and the need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. William Lester Suff's story is one of unimaginable darkness, a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity. Yet, it also serves as a call to action, a reminder of the need for compassion, justice, and the tireless pursuit of truth. As we remember the victims and reflect on the lessons of this case, we are reminded that even in the face of evil, the fight for justice and humanity must never waver.